The snow in Seattle had a way of falling without urgency. Not the wild kind that blinds you, not the cheerful flakes from postcards, but a quiet, persistent snow that soaked through coats and settled into bones. The kind that reminded you how small you were even in a city built of glass and steel. Callum Reed pulled his collar higher as he stepped out the back entrance of his office building. It was Christmas Eve, well past 9. The parking lot was nearly empty, the city muted under a thin white blanket. Most people were home by now with families' warm kitchens and the comfort of familiar voices. Callum had none of that waiting for him. He paused for a moment, keys in hand, staring at the reflection of his own tired face in the darkened glass. 47 years old. Founder of a company people admired. A life that looked complete from the outside and felt hollow on the inside. That was when he heard it. At first he thought it was the wind. It slid through the narrow alley behind the building, rattling trash lids and carrying the distant hum of traffic. But then it came again. Softer this time. Fragile, Mr. Callum froze. He turned slowly, his shoes crunching against the thin ice on the pavement. The alley was dim, lit only by a flickering security light halfway down the wall. Snow drifted lazily through the beam. And there, between two overflowing dumpsters, was a small shape curled into itself. A child. She could not have been more than 5. Maybe younger. Her body was wrapped in an oversized coat that clearly did not belong to her, the sleeves swallowing her hands. One small shoe clung crookedly to her foot. The other was missing entirely. Callum's chest tightened. She was sitting on flattened cardboard knees, pulled up to her chest, a worn backpack tucked under her head like a pillow. Her hair, dark and softly tangled, clung to her cheeks, damp from melting snow. Her face was flushed red, not from warmth, but from the cold biting at her skin. For a long moment, Callum could not move. He had negotiated million-dollar deals without breaking a sweat. Had stood in hospital corridors years ago, hearing words that fractured his world. And yet, the sight of this small, silent child brought him to a standstill. Her lips trembled as she looked up at him, eyes too tired for someone so young. "I'm just trying to find my mom," she whispered. The words landed heavier than any accusation. Callum stepped closer, careful not to startle her. The cold air stung his face, but suddenly he felt unbearably warm. His heart racing, his thoughts tangled. "Hey," he said, gently lowering himself to one knee. "It's okay. You're okay." She didn't cry. That was what struck him most. There was no panic in her expression, just exhaustion. The kind that comes after you have been afraid for too long. "She works at a hospital," the girl murmured, her voice hoarse. "She said if I got lost, I should go where there are lights." Callum swallowed hard. His hands hesitated before he slowly unwound the scarf from around his neck and wrapped it around her shoulders, careful, respectful. She clutched it instinctively, her fingers stiff and bluish with cold. "You did the right thing," he said, surprised by the tremor in his own voice. "You were very brave." She leaned into the warmth without protest, her small body shockingly cold through the fabric. Snow continued to fall, settling quietly around them. The city stood still, as if holding its breath. Callum pulled out his phone and dialed for help, his voice steady but only just. As he gave the address, he glanced down at the child again, at the way her eyelids fluttered heavy with fatigue. Somewhere deep inside him, a memory stirred. A hospital room, a tiny hand once held. A promise he had failed to keep. And in that narrow alley on a night meant for miracles, Callum Reed realized something had already changed. He was no longer just passing through. The siren arrived sooner than Callum expected, slicing through the quiet snowfall like a blade of light and sound. Red and white reflections bounced off the wet brick walls, turning the narrow alley into a small, trembling stage. 2 paramedics stepped out, boots crunching on ice, their movements brisk but careful. Callum didn't loosen his hold on the girl. He felt the chill of her body through his coat, the way her breathing fluttered shallow against his chest. "She's been out here a while," he said, keeping his voice steady. "She's cold. I think she might be sick." One of the paramedics nodded already, wrapping a thermal blanket around her small frame. "Good call," he murmured. "Hypothermia is a real risk." The girl barely stirred as they worked. Her head rested against Callum's shoulder, trusting in a way that unsettled him. When the oxygen mask hovered near her face, her eyes opened briefly. "Don't worry," Callum whispered. "They're here to help." She searched his face as if committing it to memory, then relaxed again. The paramedic glanced at him. "You can ride with us if you want. You found her." Callum hesitated for half a heartbeat. Somewhere a part of his mind ticked through obligations, an empty house, a son waiting with a sitter, unanswered messages on his phone. But none of it mattered. "Yes," he said, "I'll come." Inside the ambulance, the air was warm and smelled faintly of antiseptic and rubber. The girl's color improved slowly as heat returned to her skin. Callum sat close, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the stretcher, careful not to overwhelm her. "What's your name?" he asked softly. She swallowed, then whispered, "Elowen." "It's a beautiful name," he said, and meant it. Her lips curved just enough to suggest a smile. "My mom picked it." The ambulance rolled through the city lights, blurring past snow-dusted storefronts and darkened windows. Callum watched the girl's chest rise and fall, counting breaths without realizing it. With each block, the weight in his chest grew heavier. At the hospital doors slid open to a familiar rush of sounds, footsteps, distant voices, the steady hum of machines. Nurses moved quickly, practiced and calm. Elowen was lifted gently from his arms, and for the first time since he had found her, Callum felt the cold fully settle into his own bones. A nurse looked up at him. "Do you know where her parents might be?" "She said her mom works here," Callum replied. "She was trying to find her." The nurse exchanged a glance with a colleague. "We'll check the records." They wheeled Elowen away, leaving Callum standing in the hallway, hands empty, heart unsteady. He followed until he was asked to wait, then stopped, feeling oddly unsure of where to put himself. Hospitals had always done this to him. The smell, the lighting, the way time felt different inside these walls, stretched thin, heavy with memory. He leaned back against the cool tile and closed his eyes. Years ago, he had stood in a place like this, listening to a doctor explain things he hadn't been ready to hear. He remembered the sound of monitors, the tight grip of a hand that grew weaker by the minute. He remembered promising he would be right there, that he wasn't going anywhere, and then being too late. A nurse approached, breaking the memory. "Sir, we found a possible match." Callum's heart jumped. Her mother. "There's a woman in intensive care," the nurse said carefully. "Admitted last night. Unidentified. She collapsed while working." Working? Callum followed her down the hall, each step heavier than the last. In the ICU, the light dimmed, and the air felt dense, humming with quiet urgency. Machines beeped softly around a row of beds. The nurse stopped at one. "This is her." The woman lay, still pale, beneath thin sheets, tubes, and wires, tracing the fragile line between presence and absence. Her face was drawn, exhausted, as if life itself had asked too much of her. Callum noticed the jacket folded on a nearby chair, dark blue, worn at the cuffs. When Elowen was brought in, her reaction was immediate. She stiffened, eyes widening. "That's her," she breathed. "That's my mom's jacket." She moved closer, stopping just short of the bed, hands gripping the rail. "Mom," she whispered, "it's me." There was no response, only the steady rhythm of the monitor. Elowen didn't cry. She simply stood there, shoulders tight, watching for any sign. When her small hand reached out and touched her mother's fingers, Callum held his breath. The fingers twitched. Elowen gasped, tears finally spilling over. "She felt me," she said. "She knows I'm here." Callum felt something break open inside him. Not loudly, not all at once, just enough to let something warm seep in where the cold had been living. Later, Elowen was settled in a quiet room nearby, bundled under clean blankets. The nurse explained they would keep her overnight, given the circumstances. Callum nodded, relief mixing with a new, unfamiliar worry. When his phone buzzed, he nearly jumped. A message from the sitter Briars asking when you'll be home. Callum stared at the screen. Briar, his son, 9 years old already, too good at pretending he didn't need things. Callum typed back quickly, explaining there had been an emergency, promising he would come soon. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked through the glass at Elowen, already drifting towards sleep, one hand still clutching the scarf he had given her. The nurse returned. "You can stay a bit longer if you want," she said quietly. "She seems calmer when you're nearby." Callum nodded, though the word stay echoed louder than it should have. He sat in the chair beside Elowen's bed, hands folded, posture stiff. Outside, snow continued to fall, indifferent to the fragile lives moving beneath it. He wondered when the choice had been made. Was it the moment he turned toward a voice in the dark? The moment he wrapped his scarf around her shoulders? Or had it started long before that, years ago, when he learned how much it hurt to walk away? Callum watched Elowen sleep, her breathing finally deep and steady. Somewhere down the hall, her mother lay suspended between worlds. Somewhere across the city, his son waited, trying to be brave. For the first time in a long while, Callum felt the full weight of being needed. And this time, he didn't step back from it. The night stretched longer than it should have. Hospitals always did that turned minutes into something heavy, something that pressed down on the chest. Callum sat in the hard-backed chair beside Elowen's bed, watching the slow rhythm of her breathing. Each rise and fall felt like a small victory, fragile but real. Outside the narrow window, the snow had shifted from a gentle fall to something steadier. Streetlights blurred into pale halos, and the city seemed to retreat into itself. Christmas Eve slipped quietly toward Christmas morning. A nurse stepped in her shoes, barely making a sound on the floor. She checked Elowen's vitals, adjusted the blanket, then paused when she noticed Callum still sitting there. "You can get some rest if you need it," she said kindly. "We'll watch her." Callum shook his head. "I'm fine." It wasn't true, but it was the closest thing to truth he could offer. The nurse hesitated. "Her mother's name is Maribel Cross," she added. "We found an ID in her locker. She was working a night cleaning shift when she collapsed." Callum nodded slowly, letting the name settle. Maribel Cross. A real name now. Not just a woman in a bed surrounded by machines. "Is she?" He didn't finish the question. "She's stable," the nurse said carefully, "but she hasn't regained consciousness. The next few hours matter." The words followed Callum even after the nurse left. The next few hours matter. They always did. And too often they were the hours when everything slipped away. Elowen stirred her brow, creasing as if she were caught between sleep and worry. Callum leaned forward instinctively. "It's okay," he whispered. "You're safe." Her eyes opened halfway. "Is my mom still here?" "Yes," he said. "She's still here." Elowen studied his face, searching for something deeper than reassurance. Children always did. "You won't go, right?" The question struck harder than he expected. "I'll be right here," he answered, choosing each word carefully. "I promise." She relaxed her grip, loosening on the edge of the blanket. Within moments, she drifted back into sleep. Callum exhaled slowly. Promises were dangerous things. His phone buzzed again, this time insistently. He stepped into the hallway to answer it. Dad Breyer's voice came through tight with effort. "The sitter said you might not come home tonight." Callum closed his eyes. "I know, buddy. Something came up." "Are you okay?" Breyer asked. Callum glanced back toward Elowen's room, the soft light spilling under the door. "I will be," he said. "I need you to be brave for me tonight." There was a pause. "Is it bad?" "It's important," Callum said. "I'll explain when I get home." Breyer didn't argue. He rarely did. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll wait." When the call ended, Callum stayed still for a long moment, phone pressed to his palm. The weight of being pulled in two directions settled heavily on him. One child asleep in a hospital bed, another waiting miles away, both needing more than he could give all at once. He returned to the chair, rubbing his hands together to warm them. The clock on the wall crept forward indifferent. Sometime after midnight, the monitor down the hall changed its tone. Not an alarm, just a subtle shift. But Callum felt it immediately like a tightening in the air. He stood as a doctor and two nurses hurried past him into the ICU. He followed at a distance, stopping just outside the glass. Maribel lay motionless, her chest rising unevenly now. A nurse adjusted medication. The doctor spoke quietly. His expression focused, but tense. Callum's stomach twisted. He didn't know this woman, not really. And yet everything about this moment felt personal. A nurse noticed him and stepped out. "Sir, we're asking visitors to step back for a bit." "Is she getting worse?" Callum asked. The nurse hesitated just long enough. "She's fighting," she said. "That's all I can say. She's fighting." Callum nodded and stepped away, returning to Elowen's room. The child slept on, unaware of the invisible line her mother was walking. Callum sat again, this time closer, resting his forearms on his knees. His thoughts drifted backward, uninvited, to another hospital, another night, another woman who had fought quietly until she couldn't anymore. He remembered the way time had betrayed him then. How he'd been called into a meeting, how he'd told himself there would be time later, how later never came. A quiet anger stirred beneath his ribs, not at anyone else, but at himself. This time he murmured under his breath, "I'm here." The hours crawled. Around 2 a.m, Elowen woke, crying out, her small body jolting upright. Callum was on his feet instantly. No, no, don't go, she whimpered, tears spilling over. Please don't go. I'm here, he said, pulling the chair close. I didn't go anywhere. She reached for him without thinking, her fingers curling into the sleeve of his sweater. He froze for a moment, then gently covered her hand with his own. Her breathing slowed. She always comes back, Elowen said through a sniffle. Even when she's tired, Callum swallowed. Your mom sounds very strong. Elowen nodded sleepily. She says being strong doesn't mean not being scared. A child shouldn't have to know that, Callum thought. And yet she did. By dawn, the snow had stopped. Pale light filtered through the windows, washing the hospital in muted gray and gold. Callum hadn't slept. His body ached, his mind foggy, but he remained upright, alert, listening. A doctor finally approached him, her posture gentler now. She's still with us, she said. Your being here, you're calm. It helps her daughter more than you know. Callum nodded, emotion pressing against his throat. Thank you. As the doctor walked away, Callum looked down at Elowen, who was awake now, quietly tracing shapes on the blanket. Morning, he said softly. She looked up. Did we make it? Callum smiled faintly. We did. She considered this, then leaned back against the pillow. Outside, the city began to stir. Somewhere, Christmas morning was beginning, uneven, imperfect, but alive. Callum realized then that whatever happened next, there was no turning back. He had crossed a line the night before, stepped into someone else's story, someone else's pain. And the waiting hours had changed him. Because staying was harder than leaving, and this time he had chosen the harder thing. By mid-morning, the hospital had shifted into a different rhythm. The night's urgency had softened into something steadier. Phones ringing, carts rolling down hallways, the low murmur of voices trying to sound hopeful. Christmas Day had arrived quietly, without ceremony, as if even the calendar understood that this was not a day for celebration. Callum Reed hadn't moved from his chair. Elowen sat on the bed now, wrapped in a clean sweater a nurse had found in the lost and found. Her feet dangled just above the floor as she swung them back and forth, absent-mindedly humming to herself. Every few minutes, her eyes drifted toward the door that led to the intensive care unit. Is it almost time to see her again? She asked softly. Soon, Callum replied. The doctor said she needs more rest. Elowen nodded, accepting the answer without protest. Children learned early which questions not to push. Callum's phone buzzed in his pocket. He already knew who it would be. He stepped into the hallway before answering, lowering his voice. Hey, Dad. Briar's voice sounded different, tighter-edged, with something sharp he rarely let through. Are you coming home? Callum closed his eyes for a moment. Not yet. Silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. You said you'd explain, Briar said finally. I will, Callum replied. I promise. Another pause, then quieter. Is it about them? Callum leaned against the wall, the coolness seeping through his coat. Yes. Briar exhaled slowly, the sound brittle. So you're choosing them. The words landed harder than any accusation Callum had faced in years. That's not. He stopped himself, realizing how quickly he'd moved to defend instead of listen. I'm not choosing anyone over you. That's not how it feels, Briar said. You missed Christmas morning. Callum swallowed. I know. I woke up and you weren't here. Briar continued, the control in his voice thinning. I waited. The sitter made pancakes. She said you'd call. You didn't. Callum's chest tightened. He glanced back toward Elowen's room, where the girl was carefully arranging crayons on the tray table, focused on keeping herself calm. I didn't forget, Callum said. Something happened. Someone needed help. Everyone always needs help, Briar shot back. But you're my dad. The hallway felt suddenly too narrow, the air too thin. I'm asking you to trust me, Callum said. Just for a little while. Briar laughed, a short, humorless sound. You always say that. Callum had no answer for that. I want to come there, Briar said abruptly. What? Callum straightened. I want to see, Briar said. I want to know who's more important than me. That's not fair, Callum said, the words sharper than he intended. No, Briar replied quietly. It's honest. They sat in the truth of that for a moment. I'll pick you up, Callum said at last. Give me an hour. When he hung up, his hand trembled slightly as he slid the phone back into his pocket. He returned to Elowen's room and knelt beside her. I need to step out for a bit, he said gently. Someone important to me is coming. Her eyes widened. You're leaving? Just to get him. Callum said quickly. "I'll come back." She studied his face, searching for cracks. "You promise?" The word again. Callum nodded. "I promise." She seemed to consider this, then reached out and pressed a crayon into his hand. "Bring him this," she said. "So he knows you're nice?" Callum smiled despite himself. "I think he already knows," he said softly. Outside, the streets were slushy and gray, the snow half melted into uneven piles along the sidewalks. Callum drove in silence, rehearsing explanations that all felt insufficient. When Briar got into the car, he didn't say hello. They drove back just as quietly. At the hospital, Briar walked a few steps behind his father, hands stuffed into his coat pockets, shoulders stiff. His eyes flicked toward Elowyn the moment they entered the room. She looked up, startled. "That's him," Callum said. "Briar, this is Elowyn." They stared at each other, curiosity and caution mirrored in their expressions. "Hi," Elowyn said first. Briar nodded once. "Hey, no warmth, no hostility, just distance." Callum pulled a chair closer. "Sit with me." Briar didn't argue, but he didn't relax either. His gaze kept returning to the door of the ICU. "That your mom?" he asked Elowyn. She nodded. "She's sleeping." For a long time, Briar said not unkindly. Elowyn shrugged. She said sometimes bodies need to catch up. Briar frowned slightly as if he hadn't expected wisdom. A nurse poked her head in. "Mr. Reed, the doctor can speak with you now." Callum stood glancing between the two children. "I'll be right back." As soon as he left the room, felt different. Briar shifted in his chair, eyes fixed on the floor. "My mom died," he said abruptly. Elowyn went very still. "She didn't come back," Briar continued. "Everyone said she was tired too. Then they said she was gone." Elowyn's lower lip trembled. "My mom always comes back." Briar looked at her, something raw flashing in his eyes. "They all say that." When Callum returned, the air felt charged, brittle. "The doctor says she's stable," he said quickly. "Still critical, but stable." Elowyn exhaled in relief. Briar didn't respond. They sat together in silence until Briar stood abruptly. "Can I talk to you?" he asked Callum, jerking his head toward the hallway. Once outside, Briar rounded on him. "You didn't tell me she could die." Callum stiffened. "I didn't want to scare you." "You don't get to decide that," Briar snapped. "You're acting like you're her dad." The words cut deep. "I'm acting like someone who won't walk away," Callum replied, his voice low but steady. Briar's hands clenched into fists. "What if you don't come back to me?" Callum's breath caught. He knelt, bringing himself level with his son. "Look at me," he said. "I am not leaving you. Ever." Briar's eyes filled despite his efforts. "Then why does it feel like I'm losing you again?" Callum reached out, stopping just short of touching him. "Because when we lost your mom, I shut everything else out," he said. "I made it just us, because that felt safer." Briar sniffed. And now, Callum continued, "I'm realizing that loving someone else doesn't mean loving you less." Briar shook his head. "That's not how it works." "It is," Callum said gently. "It just takes time to feel it." They stood there, father and son, both afraid of the same thing and too young both of them to know how to say it. Inside the room, Elowyn sat quietly coloring. She drew two figures holding hands. Then she added a third. Then, after a pause, a fourth. When Callum and Briar returned, she held up the picture. "This is what it looks like when people help each other," she said. Briar studied the drawing. "Who's that?" "That's you," Elowyn said simply. "You're tall." Briar blinked, thrown off. "I am." Something in his posture softened. Callum felt it then, a shift. Small, fragile, but real. Not a solution, just a beginning. Before we go deeper into the story, there will be situations involving children, family, loss, and personal responsibility. This content is intended to remind listeners of the importance of presence, compassion, and the choices that can change an entire life. If you are not ready for these emotions, please consider pausing before continuing. The hospital quieted again in the late afternoon. Christmas Day moved forward outside the walls. Cars passing, families gathering, laughter drifting from somewhere far away, but inside time felt paused, as if the building itself were holding something back, waiting for the right moment to let it surface. Callum stood alone in the intensive care unit hallway. Elowyn had finally fallen asleep again, worn out from the long morning. Briar sat nearby with a book he wasn't really reading, his attention fixed on the closed ICU doors. Neither child spoke. Words felt dangerous now, like they might knock something loose before it was ready. A nurse approached Callum quietly. "Mr. Reed, we need to document some personal belongings," she said. "Would you mind helping?" Callum nodded and followed her back into the ICU room. Maribel Cross lay unchanged. Her breathing supported her face, still pale, but calmer than it had been the night before. The nurse gestured to the chair where Maribel's jacket had been folded since her admission. "If there's anything valuable or identifying," she said, "we'll secure it." Callum picked up the jacket carefully. It was heavier than it looked, worn, familiar-shaped by years of use. The sleeves were frayed at the cuffs. There was a faint scent clinging to the fabric cleaning solution winter air, and something softer beneath it. He checked the outer pockets first. A few coins, a transit card. Nothing unusual. Then his fingers brushed against paper inside the inner pocket. Callum paused. He slid the folded item out slowly. It was an envelope yellowed with age, creased and softened as if it had been opened and closed many times. The handwriting on the front was neat but slightly uneven, written with care rather than confidence. "Thank you." That was all it said. Callum frowned and unfolded the paper inside. The note was short. No date, no last name. "Thank you for staying with me when I was scared. Thank you for holding my hand when everything felt like it was slipping away. I never even got your name, but you told me to breathe, and I did. You told me I was strong, and for a moment I believed it. Whoever you are, please know that you changed my life." Callum's breath caught. The room felt suddenly smaller. His mind reached backward unbidden, past years, past grief, past a night he rarely allowed himself to remember clearly. A hospital room. Bright lights, a young nurse with calm eyes and a steady voice. "You're doing great," she had said. "Stay with me. Breathe." Callum gripped the edge of the bed. The memory sharpened. He remembered the gloves, blue soft-looking against the sterile white. He remembered how that nurse hadn't let go even when everything else had started to unravel. How she had spoken not just to his wife, but to him, anchoring him when he'd been on the edge of panic. He had never learned her name. He had never thought he'd see her again. Callum looked at Maribel's face, really looked this time. The curve of her cheekbone, the set of her mouth, the quiet strength in her stillness. "Oh my God," he whispered. The nurse glanced at him. "Are you all right?" Callum nodded automatically, though his heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. "Yes," he said. "I just remembered something." He folded the note carefully and slipped it back into the pocket. When he stepped out of the ICU room, the world felt tilted. He leaned against the wall, one hand pressed to his chest, breathing slowly until the past stopped crashing into the present. Years ago, someone had stood between his family and the worst moment of their lives. And now that same woman lay here alone, with no one but her child and a stranger who had stumbled into her story. Or had he, Briar, noticed him first, Dad? Callum straightened. "Hey, you look weird," Briar said bluntly. Callum let out a shaky breath. "I just found something." Elowen stirred at the sound of his voice and sat up blinking. "Is my mom okay?" "She's still fighting," Callum said, kneeling in front of her. "Just like she did before." Elowen tilted her head. "Before what?" Callum hesitated. "This might sound strange," he said carefully, "but your mom helped my family once, a long time ago." Elowen's eyes widened. "She helps people. That's what she does." Briar looked between them confused. "What do you mean, helped?" Callum glanced at the ICU doors, then back at the children. "When your mom was younger," he said to Elowen, "she worked as a nurse." Elowen smiled faintly. "She says it was the best job. She helped my wife," Callum continued, his voice thickening. "The night you were born." Briar froze. "The night Mom died." Callum nodded. The hallway went quiet. Elowen's mouth opened slightly, then closed. "So she knew you. She didn't know my name," Callum said. "And I didn't know hers, but she stayed when it mattered most." Elowen's gaze drifted toward the ICU doors. "She always stays." Briar sat back, slowly absorbing the weight of it. "So this isn't just random." "No," Callum said softly. "It's not." They sat together, the three of them, in a silence that felt different from the others that had come before. This one was heavy, but it wasn't empty. Hours passed. The light outside the windows faded from gray to amber. Nurses came and went. The machines continued their quiet work. Just after sunset, a doctor approached with measured steps. "Mr. Reed," she said, "we're seeing a response." Callum stood so quickly his chair scraped against the floor. What kind of response, small, she said, but real. They followed her into the ICU. Maribel's fingers twitched again more clearly this time. Her brow furrowed as if she were waking from a deep, complicated dream. Elowen Callum whispered, kneeling beside the bed. "She can hear you." Elowen stepped forward, her small hand finding her mother's. "Mom," she said softly. "I found you." Maribel's lips parted. No words came out, but a sound did. A breath that seemed to reach for the air. Tears streamed down Elowen's face as she laughed and cried at the same time. "You came back," she said. "I knew you would." Callum stood behind her, one hand resting gently on her shoulder, his other clenched tight at his side. He felt the twist of fate settle into something steadier now, not shock, not disbelief, but recognition. This wasn't coincidence. It was return. Later, when the room emptied again and Maribel drifted back into sleep, Callum stepped aside, pulling the note from his pocket once more. This time he didn't just read it, he answered it. Not on paper, not yet. But with presence, with staying, with the quiet certainty that some kindnesses don't disappear when they're given away. They wait, patient, unclaimed, until the moment they're needed again. Recovery did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, small movements, half open, eyes a breath that lasted a second longer than the one before. In the days after Christmas, the hospital settled into a cautious rhythm around Maribel Cross, as if everyone understood that rushing would only do harm. Callum learned the language of waiting. He learned how to recognize the sound of a good morning from a nurse's tone alone, how to read hope in a doctor's careful phrasing, how to sit without speaking and still be present. Elowen counted the days by stickers on a paper calendar a volunteer had taped to the wall. A star for each morning her mother opened her eyes. A heart for each night she squeezed her hand back. Briar came every afternoon after school. At first he kept his distance, hovering in doorways asking polite questions, staying alert as if this kindness might suddenly ask something from him. But children adjusted faster than adults when no one tried to force them. One afternoon, Elowen tugged on his sleeve. "Can you reach that shelf?" Briar hesitated, then stood on tiptoe and grabbed a box of crayons. "These," she nodded. "Mom likes the blue one." Briar handed it over carefully. "This one?" "That's it," Elowen said, smiling. Something eased in Briar's shoulders. Callum noticed these moments the way people noticed birds returning in spring, not dramatic, but unmistakable. He watched his son explain the rules of a card game, watched Elowen listen with complete seriousness, nodding as if he were passing down sacred knowledge, watched himself feel less afraid. Maribel woke more fully on the fourth day. Her voice was hoarse, her movements slow, but her eyes were sharp, observant in a way that suggested she had always paid attention even when life moved too fast to keep up. When Callum entered the room that morning, she studied him for a long moment. "You stayed," she said quietly. "Yes," he replied. She looked past him to where Elowen sat at the small table drawing. "She told me." Callum didn't know what to say to that. Gratitude felt too small a word. Apologies felt out of place. So he simply nodded. "I don't remember everything," Maribel continued, "but I remember trying to finish my shift, thinking I could make it home, thinking I just needed a minute." Her fingers curled into the blanket. "I didn't mean to leave her alone." "You didn't," Callum said gently. "You told her where to go." She followed the light. Maribel closed her eyes briefly, the relief washing over her face. "She always listens," she murmured, "even when she's scared." That afternoon, the doctor spoke with them together, Callum standing slightly back, giving space but not leaving. "You're going to need time," the doctor said. "Rest, follow-up care, and support." Maribel nodded slowly. "I don't have much of that." Callum felt the words settle between them, heavy but honest. Later, when Elowen went with a nurse to pick out a book from the children's cart, Maribel turned to him. "You don't owe us anything," she said, her voice steady despite the weariness beneath it. "I don't want you to feel like I know," Callum interrupted gently. "I'm not here because I owe you." She studied him, then looked away. "Then why are you here?" Callum thought of the note in her jacket, of the night his wife had died, of Briar's question in the hallway, of the promise he had made to himself in the dark. "Because staying matters," he said finally. Maribel nodded once. "It does." Discharge planning took longer than anyone expected. Maribel's apartment was small up 2 narrow flights of stairs and not ideal for someone recovering from a neurological event. The social worker spoke in careful terms. Temporary housing options, home health visits, wait lists that stretched longer than hope. Callum listened without interrupting. When the conversation ended, he cleared his throat. "I have a guest room," he said, "and a ground floor." The room went quiet. Maribel stared at him startled. "That's generous, but no." Callum nodded, accepting the refusal. "Okay," but the idea lingered. It came up again that evening, then again the next day, each time framed differently, less like a rescue and more like a bridge. No pressure, no assumptions. Finally, Maribel asked, "Would your son be okay with that?" Callum didn't answer immediately. He deserves to be part of the decision. So they asked him. Briar listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. "You wouldn't be moving forever," Callum said. "Just until things are steady." Briar glanced at Elowyn, who was busy lining up toy animals on the windowsill. "Would she have to share a room?" "No," Callum said quickly. Briar considered this. "Would we still read at night?" "Yes," Callum said. "That doesn't change." Briar nodded slowly. "Okay." Maribel's eyes filled. "You don't have to say yes just because you're being nice." Briar looked up at her. "I'm not," he said simply. "I just don't want her to be scared." That night, when Callum tucked Briar into bed, his son hesitated before speaking. "You're different," Briar said. "Better or worse?" Callum asked softly. Briar shrugged. "Quieter, but in a good way." Callum smiled. "I'll take that." Maribel and Elowyn moved in on a gray Thursday morning. There were no speeches, no announcements, just suitcases carried in a bed made up with fresh sheets and Elowyn's backpack set carefully by the door like a promise. The house changed slowly. Shoes by the entryway that weren't theirs before, drawings taped to the refrigerator, a small laugh echoing down the hallway at unexpected moments. Maribel moved carefully, respecting boundaries, offering help without insisting. She cooked when she had the strength, rested when she didn't. Callum adjusted his schedule, leaving meetings early, turning down things that suddenly seemed less urgent. One evening, as they sat at the table folding laundry, Maribel paused. "You don't have to keep doing this," she said. "I'll be okay?" Callum folded a towel neatly. "I know." She watched him. Then, "Why are you still here?" Callum looked up, meeting her gaze. "Because I want to be." The answer surprised them both. Weeks passed. Maribel regained strength. Elowyn returned to school. Briar grew used to another presence at breakfast, another voice asking about his day. Nothing was perfect. There were awkward moments, missed cues, silences that needed time. But there was also warmth. One night, after the children were asleep, Callum found Maribel standing at the window watching snowfall again, lighter this time, almost gentle. "Do you ever feel guilty," she asked quietly, "for letting yourself be okay?" Callum thought of his wife. Of the years he had lived like happiness was a betrayal. "Yes," he admitted, "but I'm learning that surviving isn't the same as living." Maribel nodded. "I spent so long just trying to get through the day. I forgot what it felt like to look ahead." They stood together, not touching but close enough to feel the shared warmth. The house was quiet, not empty, just still, and for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. The snow returned the following Christmas almost on schedule, not the heavy, relentless kind from the year before, but a softer snowfall, slow and deliberate, as if the sky had learned how much weight was enough. It settled on the roof of the small house at the edge of the city, clinging to pine branches and window ledges like a quiet benediction. Inside the house was warm. Callum stood at the kitchen counter pouring coffee into mismatched mugs. The tree in the corner leaned slightly to the left, decorated with ornaments that didn't match but somehow belonged together. Paper snowflakes hung from the ceiling, uneven and proud. Someone had taped a child's drawing to the refrigerator, a house, 4 stick figures, and a sun in the corner, smiling. From the living room came laughter. Briar sat cross-legged on the floor, helping Elowyn untangle a string of lights that had clearly lost the battle last year. She laughed every time he pretended the lights were alive, wriggling away from him. "Stop moving," she said, giggling. "They're stubborn," Briar replied seriously. "Like you." Elowyn grinned. "I learned from you." Maribel watched them from the doorway, one hand resting lightly on the frame. Her hair had grown back thicker than before, her color steady now, her posture relaxed in a way it hadn't been a year ago. She wore a simple sweater sleeves, pushed-up flower, dusting her fingers from the cookies cooling on the counter. Callum caught her eye and lifted his mug slightly. She smiled back, not the careful smile of gratitude from months ago, but something easier, familiar. Later, as the morning unfolded without hurry, Elowen padded into the kitchen holding a book, its spine worn, pages soft with use. "Will you read it?" she asked, holding it up to Callum. He knelt to her level. "Of course." Briar leaned against the counter. "That's my favorite one," he said, "but you have to do the voices." Callum chuckled. "I was hoping you'd forget that." They gathered on the couch, the book open between them. Callum's voice filled the room steady and calm. Elowen leaned against his side without thinking. Briar rested his head against the arm of the couch, listening even though he already knew every word. Maribel watched from the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around her mug. She didn't interrupt. Some moments were meant to be witnessed, not entered. When the story ended, Elowen sighed contentedly. "This is my favorite part of Christmas." Callum brushed a stray curl from her forehead. "Mine too." Outside, the snow continued its quiet work. Later that afternoon, as daylight faded into a soft gray, Maribel stepped outside onto the porch. Callum joined her, pulling his coat tighter. "I used to think," she said quietly, "that all I was meant to do was survive. Just get through the next hour, the next shift, the next night." Callum nodded. "I know that feeling." She looked at him. "I didn't think a life like this was meant for someone like me." Callum met her gaze. "It was always meant for you. You just hadn't found it yet." She let out a slow breath, the cold air blooming white in front of her. "Thank you," she said, not as a debt, but as a truth. For staying, she added. Callum thought of the alley, the hospital, the waiting hours, the fear of opening his heart again. "Thank you," he replied, "for coming back." Inside, Briar and Elowen pressed their faces to the window, leaving smudges on the glass as they waved at the falling snow. The house glowed behind them, soft lights, quiet music, the sound of people moving together without rushing. Callum took it in, not afraid anymore that it might disappear if he named it. This was not the life he had planned, but it was the one he had chosen. And sometimes he realized the families that last aren't the ones we're born into. They're the ones we find when we finally stop walking past the light. Sometimes the moments that change our lives don't arrive loudly. They come as a quiet choice to stop, to listen, to stay. This story reminds us that kindness never disappears, it waits. And when the time is right, it finds its way back, often through the people who need it most. Family isn't always about where we come from. Sometimes it's about who we choose to stand beside when it matters. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to Tales of Kindness. Here we tell stories that heal, inspire, and remind us that no one is ever truly alone. Until next time, keep your heart open.